Good evening and a warm welcome to everyone to tonight's online event, A False Choice, British Naval Power in the Baltic and the Pacific, hosted by the Centre for Geopolitics at Cambridge University. I'm Victoria Starek Summerlin, co-founder and director of strategy of the newest foreign affairs think tank based in the heart of London, the Council on Geostrategy. And it is my absolute pleasure to host tonight's event. The Integrated Review has set ambitious goals for British naval expansion over the course of the 2020s. It is a key part of the UK's tilt to the Indo-Pacific. The deployment of the UK carrier strike group and the announcement of AUKUS have been held up as proof of the UK's renewed commitment to sea power. But can the UK project its naval influence into the Pacific without undermining its commitments in other theatres, such as the Baltic? Both the Baltic and the Pacific are vital regions for today's geopolitical challenges due to a rising China and, of course, aggressive Russia. How the UK manages and uses its navy will determine how much of a say the country has in the future of these theatres. And to discuss this important question, the Centre for Geopolitics has assembled a stellar panel of experts with experience in the military, academia, and politics. We are absolutely delighted to be joined tonight by Alicia Kearns, a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and co-chair of the China Research Group, Professor Andrew Lambert, a naval historian and the author of The British Way of War, Julian Corbett and the Battle for a National Strategy, and of course Rear Admiral Chris Parry, former Royal Navy officer, strategic forecaster, broadcaster, and best-selling author. Alicia Kearns is a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee at the House of Commons. She has been a member of Parliament since 2019. She studied social and political sciences at Cambridge, graduating back in 2009. Alicia previously worked in communication roles at the Ministry of Defence, Ministry of Justice, and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. She has been a member of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee since March 2020. Professor Andrew Lambert is Lawton Professor of Naval History at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where he also directs the Lawton Naval Unit. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and an Advisory Council member at the Council on Geostrategy. He received the 2014 Anderson Medal for his book, The Challenge, Britain Against America in the Naval War of 1812. And his latest book is Sea Power States, Maritime Culture, Continental Empires, and the Conflict That Made the Modern World, which won the 2018 Gilder Lehrman Book Prize in Military History. He is also the author of The British Way of War, Julian Corbett, and the Battle for National Strategy. And we are joined by Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. Having spent more than 2 decades in the Royal Navy, Chris Parry served with distinction in the Falklands War, being mentioned in dispatches for his heroic deeds. His naval career began back in 1972, and by 1989 he had risen to the command of HMS Gloucester. In 2005, he was promoted to be Rear Admiral when he took over as Director General of the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre. Since leaving the Royal Navy in 2008, he has worked in the private sector as a writer, broadcaster, and public speaker. So without any further delay, Professor Lambert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Victoria. It's a great pleasure to be with you and such a distinguished panel this evening. Is it a false choice? Yes, it is. It's not a choice that has to be made. Britain, as a maritime power across the last 500 years, has consistently been able to maximize its strategic reach into the regions that are important. It's not the Baltic or the China Seas or the Indian Ocean. It's wherever there's a need to deploy national power and to support the national interest. And across history, we've seen Britain operate in all of the world's oceans and meet different challenges at different stages. I think one of the problems that strategists have in conceiving the current situation is they imagine that strategy is somewhat constrained by terrestrial boundaries. And maritime strategy doesn't work like that. It exploits connectivity and exploits mobility. And it has to, because it's not essentially particularly powerful in a military hardware sense. It's much more powerful in what it can achieve by controlling communications than what it can project through military force. In the current age, obviously, we look at nuclear submarines armed with ballistic missiles, but that, of course, is a separate issue altogether. And that's not something to send into the Baltic, and probably the British versions won't go anywhere near the South China Sea either. They have a very different role. It's a national strategic role. So for the Baltic, what we're looking at with Britain in the Baltic is a 500-year history of operations in the Baltic, which have consistently promoted access. So there are a series of battles around Copenhagen. Nelson was involved in one of them, and a few years later, the British captured Copenhagen. The purpose of those battles was to open up access to the Baltic to project power against Russia. In both 1801 and 1807, the enemy was Russia. And the threat ultimately was that Russia would close the Baltic Straits, much as it attempted to close the Turkish Straits in the Crimean War, and would use that control to dominate markets, to exclude Britain from economic access to the continent as part of Napoleon's continental system, and would subjugate the states within the Baltic region, starting with the conquest of Finland in 1809, but Russians had agendas to move forward and further west. The main barrier to that would be British naval power. Between 1807 and 1812, Britain's largest fleet was in the Baltic. Every year, a very large fleet went into the Baltic. The flagship of that fleet was HMS Victory, and the admiral commanding, Sir James de Saumarez, was one of Nelson's right-hand men at the Battle of the Nile, a truly great commander. And that fleet imposed a blockade on Russia so effectively that within 5 years, the Russian economy had collapsed. There was very little fighting, but the economic war impact of dominating the Baltic meant that ultimately Russia decided to fight Napoleon rather than continue fighting the British. Fighting the British didn't cost many lives, but it ruined the economy. And for that reason, the Russians broke with Napoleon. And when they did, they immediately rejoined the trading nexus with Britain, and the British military effort shifts out of the Baltic. But the British keep an eye on the Baltic. They go back in the Crimean War. It's often forgotten that the Russian capital is St. Petersburg in those days. And the war ends with an economic blockade that breaks the Russian economy within 6 to 9 months, and the threat of a full-scale naval assault on the Russian imperial capital. And it's those two pressure points that bring Russia to peace. It is not settled in the Crimea, it is settled in the Baltic. The Baltic is the primary theatre of that war, where the main Royal Navy fleet was stationed. And then as we get through towards the end of the 19th century, whenever Britain has problems with Russia, in the 1870s, Russia invades Turkey. In the 1880s, it invades Afghanistan. And on both occasions, the British mobilize a fleet for Baltic service, and the Russians back down. There's a pattern emerging here. When the main naval threat becomes Germany early in the 20th century, the more astute British planners are thinking about projecting power into the Baltic, because that is the weak point of the German economy and the place where a blockade could be particularly effective. So the Baltic is a place where you go to achieve strategic effect against particular threats, mostly in the past Russia, but also Germany. You can parallel it with operations in the Black Sea, particularly during the Crimean War, when Russia's main naval base is destroyed by an amphibious operation. What happens when those campaigns are over? When that war finishes in the 1850s, the Royal Navy goes back to doing what it's always doing, which is patrolling the critical sea areas, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean. And very shortly after the Crimean War ends, there's a major war with China. And large parts of the fleet that were assembled to fight the Russians end up on the coast of China. The mobility of naval power is critical. And the tools that are being used are tools that were developed not to fight the Russians or the Chinese, but actually to fight the French, who were the primary naval threat in the late 19th century. So this flexibility, the ability of Britain to conceive of naval power as an answer to a series of strategic problems against a range of different powers. So we have a fleet built to deal with France and possibly the United States, which ends up being used to defeat Russia and China. That, I think, is a very important parallel to draw forward as we look at the current situation and we look at future situations in the South China Sea. We need to be aware that we have choices about where we can deploy that force. And one of the key elements of the past, the present, and the future is going to be base Where are these ships going to be based? Where are the support systems going to be to enable them to continue operating? The British Empire of the 19th century is not an empire of territory, it's an empire of ports and communications. The Royal Navy's job is to protect those communications, but they also use them and use the ports through which they run in order to receive instructions, to maintain their ships, to acquire supplies. So it's a complex international system which the British are connecting up, because at the end of the day, they do not have the military power to achieve victory against large continental forces. So Britain has to think in a maritime strategic way because it is not large enough and not structured in a way that would enable it to mass produce land fighting power. So it's not going to use that kind of power. It has to use maritime power, and it has to accept and work around the limits of maritime power. This isn't the decisive knockout blow. This is different ways of applying power. So do we want to be in the Baltic or the South China Seas? The answer is we need to be able to go to either as required. Currently, British warships are in the Baltic and in the Arctic, near the coasts of Russia. But if this crisis conflict ends, they may be redeployed elsewhere. So it's the deployability of naval force in contrast to the relative limits on the deployability of military force that makes it so effective in signaling national intent, in securing national interest, and upholding national commitments. That's why those forces are positioned forward at the moment. And that's why the way to signal to Russia historically was always to mobilize the fleet and to point it at the Baltic. It worked as a deterrent in the 19th century, and it certainly worked against Germany in 1905 as well. So thinking about regions, thinking about the strategic vulnerabilities of potential adversaries, and thinking about how to use maritime power to leverage those is really critical going forward. And the past isn't going to teach us exactly how to operate, but it is going to show us some precedents around which we can begin to think, I think, quite constructively about the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lambert. And I would like now to ask Alicia Kearns to deliver her speech.
Thanks very much, Victoria, and thank you to everyone for joining us today and for the other panelists giving me the opportunity to speak alongside you. I think you probably won't get that much disagreement from all of us today that actually this is a false choice. But I would argue it's not also our choice in that we don't have the liberty of making such a choice. We face, obviously in the Baltics, the threat around Russia, and obviously in the Indo-Pacific, it is about making sure we stand by our allies and the threats we face emanating from China. And you should never really say, I don't think, when I worked in the Foreign Office or now as a politician, that we don't have a choice, we don't have the liberty or luxury of those choices. But I think we have to be pragmatic and we have to be honest with ourselves. And that is the situation in which we find ourselves. I think the UK is willing, and I think it is able to project its naval influence into the Pacific while still supporting our partners in the Baltic at the same time. But it is about being honest about the limitations if you are working in two different spheres. It's about being honest about the cost if you wish to do so effectively, and making sure that you have the capability, as Andrew started to go into real details about there, but also making sure that we have the honest conversations about what effect we're trying to achieve. It is not enough just for a politician like me to stand here and say, well, we need to be in both. Well, what effect are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to secure? What opportunities are we trying to advance? And what malign forces are we trying to cease or push back or limit the excesses of? The conflict in Ukraine has reminded us quite clearly of the threat that Russia poses, and obviously most of the media have been discussing in the last few days what some of our Baltic partners might do in terms of their long-term stability and their long-term safety. We have to think long-term when it comes to this, and we have to think about the importance of naval power when it comes to those discussions. And I think too often when we talk about the Baltics, when we talk about Ukraine and we talk about European security, the naval element is actually missed out of the conversation. And I think that's a real error. We have to appreciate the critical importance of both theatres, but we also have to make sure that we allocate those resources appropriately. the Navy really is key in that. So when you look at the Baltics, obviously there we're facing a terrorist state, and that is the primary concern. We already play a critical role, I would argue, in the Baltic with our leading of the Joint Expeditionary Force. It's obviously made up of the UK, the Netherlands, Scandinavian states, and Baltic states. And that work that we've done there has been important, as we've seen in Ukraine over the last few weeks, in terms of countries coming together and mobilizing, wanting to work as a unit and working together. But also we've seen real interoperability improvements amongst our armed forces and the participating nations' armed forces over the last few years. And that is really positive, and that's the sort of opportunities and kind of interactive working that we should be looking for in Indo-Pacific and others. Obviously, our Navy's commitments in the Baltics are reinforced by our NATO obligations and that enhanced forward presence deterrence force. So we know that we have a duty already laid out as part of our alliances that we have signed. But it is also important as we look forward that we maintain a presence in that region. So as well as playing an active deterrent to Russia, we know that obviously the region is contiguous with the high North Arctic, which is going to play a ever more strategically important role. We see China very invested and interested in what's going to happen there. We see Russia, we see competing claims from different nation states. And ultimately, that area is going to play an important role in the UK's future environmental prosperity, our energy supply, and our security over the next few decades. When it comes to Indo-Pacific, while we're not facing a terrorist state, we are facing what is often, I guess, seen as really it's a shadow threat in terms of how the general public see it, because they don't recognize the threat is there, but it is there, and we face a systemic competitor, to be polite or courteous about it. The integrated review was absolutely right to put out the Indo-Pacific as an area of real focus and concern. We do have some specific commitments there, and we've seen already how powerful the British Navy can be in the message that it sent when the aircraft carrier travelled, and how important that was, and the message it sent to our allies in terms of our commitment. And I think many countries around the Indo-Pacific do look to us to be engaged, and the force and power of the Navy really is strong. So Taiwan in particular are looking for us to show that we have agility and the ability to be there. But again, we have to work out what our goal is. The problem with the integrated review is that whilst it sets out that we want to seize economic opportunities, we want to promote the international rules-based order, we want to promote British values, whether it be the rights of the individual or transparency or democratic accountability, where are the specific effects that we are trying to achieve? Where are the specific outcomes that we are trying to achieve, particularly when it comes to naval presence, beyond the bluff and bluster of sending particular assets at particular times. There will be intensified geopolitical competition in that area, and the British Navy will play an important role, though, in delivering not just upholding our values, but long-term security of the region. We do always have choices, but I think ultimately when it comes to this, we don't have a choice, as I said at the start, between choosing which theatres we are active on when it comes to the Baltic versus the Indo-Pacific. But I think we have to make sure that when we make decisions, they aren't led by geographical choices, but actually the choices we make about what we need to deliver within these theatres and what we want to secure and what our priorities are. And I'm not sure that we are yet doing that effectively, not least because we don't have a China strategy as a UK government as yet, although that is now underway. And we don't have a wider strategy on exactly what global Britain in the Indo-Pacific looks like. And actually it's the same question in the Baltics. And I've been talking today about the Foreign Affairs Committee needing to visit the Baltics to understand what role our partners want us to play. And I think that's one of the other key missing, is that when we talk about British naval power, what do our allies want to see from British naval power? What do they need to see from us? And that's one of the big questions that we often forget, is actually it's not just about what we want to promote and what we want to project, it's also what our allies need to hear from us. So I think it is a false choice, because we don't currently have the liberty of choices, and that's because of the actions of two particularly hostile states who are antagonizing our values, interests and alliances. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and hopefully we can have a wider discussion about what effect exactly we are seeking to achieve and how the Navy can play a key role in achieving those objectives.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for your speech. I would like to encourage everyone, all our attendees, to post their questions in the Q&A window. And Admiral Chris Parry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my two colleagues leading off. I think what I've heard so far, and I agree with, is that everything is related to political objectives. One of the virtues of Margaret Thatcher in the Falklands 40 years ago was she simply said to the military and naval leaders at the time, these are my political objectives. How are you going to deliver them militarily? And that is absolutely perfect from a military point of view. But what we have to consider with regard to both these theatres is what the Navy is required to do and our maritime power is required to do in peace, tension and war, because they are very different indeed, particularly in the modern world. It's all about deterrence in peacetime, of course, resisting coercion and aggression. But the minute you go into a war situation, which is the basis of deterrence, of course, if you're not credible, you're not going to deter. You've actually got to look like you're there to do something. And if we are going to defend the international rules-based system, if we are going to project power against the land, we have to recognize, as Andrew said, that the sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web. It allows global access for all those things that travel over the internet in reality. If you think about it, ideas, goods, services, people all travel in reality over the sea at some stage. So very important indeed. But we also have to recognize that we're falling into a two-block world now, one that has, on the one hand, Eurasian autocrats, China, Russia, and Iran, and they're seeking to dominate not just the Eurasian continent, but also the seas around it. And Alicia has already highlighted Russia's interest in dominating the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Arctic. Now, we've seen in the Black Sea that that desire to dominate or neutralize the Black Sea has led to what's happened in Ukraine. We see constant pressure on the Baltic, but poor old Russia, of course, has lost a lot of beachfront property since the end of the Cold War, and they're still restricted to Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg. If Sweden and Finland join NATO, then that's all they'll have. They won't even have neutral countries to look at. Now, facing them right now, bizarrely, is what I would call the leadership of a maritime bloc, which comprises America, Canada, parts of Europe, not all of it, United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, probably Singapore, and almost certainly India at some stage soon. And all of them have strategic reasons for opposing the autocratic bloc, not least because they're all maritime powers. They use English as their data language, and they're democracies. And I think the next 30 years will be a constant fight over the allegiance of all the other countries in the world, depending on the interests of the elites in those countries. And quite a lot of that is going to be played out in the maritime sphere. Now let's talk about some facts of life about the Baltic, shall we? It lacks strategic depth. In the modern world, you can't fight a war in the Baltic as you did in Nelson's time, because there are a number of reasons why you can't. Firstly, it's very shallow. So many of the things you might want to do to conceal some of your military activity, like with submarines or submersible, it's going to be very difficult indeed. The area is covered by all sorts of listening devices and bottom arrays and things like that. The top half is actually icebound for 5.5 months of the year. You're not actually going to get north of Gotland very easily. You've got the nasty little exclave of Kaliningrad sitting there, where Russia has some of its best missile and other forces. And frankly, the combination of technology and geography means that no surface warship is going to be survivable in the Baltic in wartime. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that they will be. The proximity of land, the existence of sophisticated surveillance systems by space and on land, and the presence of unmanned hypersonic cruise and ballistic missiles means we ain't going to be fighting on the surface in the Baltic. And this is something we're going to have to get to grips with. And to be fair, United Kingdom's interest starts at the Skagerrak. We don't need to worry. We've got allies who do things, and they should do things in the Baltic. And I'm going to say to you, there is no choice here. The Royal Navy shouldn't be in the Baltic at all. There are responsible partners who can deal with that, both by land and sea and in the air. And if they need to go out there in peace and tension, that's fine. but don't expect to survive in wartime. You've just seen a fantastic demonstration why. It's called the Cruiser Moskva. And that, I'm afraid, is a lead-in feature for anybody that thinks they can fight on the surface in the Baltic. And if you can't fight, then you aren't going to deter. So we've got to think of more composite ways, more joint ways of projecting power and supporting our allies than actually putting ships in there. Winston Churchill in the Second World War had this great idea that he was going to put some old World War I battleships, the Ramillies class, into the Baltic to rough up the Germans. It took the naval leadership about a minute to dissuade them from that. And I would carry that forward to today. Yes, the Baltic's important. It's important to our allies around there. It's their real estate that they have to deal with. But let's not think we're straying into the Baltic with those forces that we have for global Britain and for power projection in those places where maritime power is optimized and can survive to fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Admiral Parry. And now we will start our Q&A session. I have a quick question for myself to kickstart the discussion. Of course, well, all eyes are on the situation in Ukraine and, well, the Black Sea region. So the question would be how the Royal Navy can support the Black Sea region allies and partners in this situation, restore security and stability in the region, and also how can it restore and uphold freedom of navigation and maritime law in the Black Sea? Professor Lambert.
Yep, this is a very important part of that transition between naval diplomacy and the borders of conflict. It's entirely legal in origin. So during the Crimean War, the British blockade was initially imposed simply by closing the Turkish Straits. But it turned out that was not a legally enforceable blockade. And so the ships actually had to go forward and physically blockade the Russian ports. So it's about establishing a legal regime which will allow you to operate a version of what the UK and other countries are doing at the moment. The current sanctions against Russia are essentially economic warfare. They've taken the place of the old-fashioned maritime blockade. We won't be seeing too many sailors boarding hostile vessels and checking their paperwork. All of this can be done electronically, and these vessels can be stopped at the point of departure or at the point of arrival. So it's about having a legal regime and an understanding of what it's possible to do. And it's very significant that in the 19th century, Britain's major interest in all the great peace treaties that it ended up signing from the fall of Napoleon down to the end of the First World War, the sticking point for Britain is the ability to use maritime economic warfare in whatever form that took at the time the treaty was signed. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the British refused to discuss these issues. This was so important. They weren't going to let anybody challenge the way that they ran economic warfare. And they traded in a lot of valuable territory, possessions, and credit with their erstwhile allies to secure that. At the end of the Crimean War, they changed the rules on privateering to make it easier for Britain to control the sea. So these were systemic changes that enhanced Britain's ability to operate. So it's about finding a legal regime in which these measures don't need to be carried out by warships. And I entirely take Chris Parry's point. We don't want warships in the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea imposing economic sanctions or anything else. We want to be able to do this at distance. And that's exactly what many of the Western nations are doing now. So we can use the physical choke point to make sure that Russia is not able to move goods in or out of the Baltic and the Black Sea. That's a very straightforward thing. We could do that in the Arctic as well. We could block the movement of Russian shipping in and out of Russia's territorial waters. The only problem there is, of course, that the Chinese are already using those waters for their own purposes. And so that may be interfering with the rights of neutrals. And we have to remember that in all of this, there will be neutral players. This is not an existential crisis in which everybody is on one side or the other. There are quite a lot of states which are hovering on the margins. And so you need to be able to target your measures so that you have maximum impact and avoid doing collateral damage to neutrals who you would like to have on your side. So ultimately, it's about getting the legal regime straight. And that's a question for legislatures and judiciaries in the states that are partnering up, and Britain as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Lambert. Ms. Kearns?
I hate to be boring, but I'm not sure I could disagree with very much of that at all anyway. That we have to stand by and do what we can. But on that one, there's not much I can really contribute except for agreeing entirely, which I imagine would be slightly more boring. I'm not sure if Chris will be able to counter and provide something slightly more interesting in terms of countering that.
Thank you, Ms.
I think, Alicia, the key thing that begs itself there is that if you've got an international rules-based system, it's got to be enforced against those people who don't believe in it. You know, one of President Putin's frequent cries right now is, we'll have new rules or we'll have no rules. And I think one feature of this two-block world that I've been talking about is you're going to see a series of encounter actions at sea between the legal regime and those that wish to overturn it. And you're going to have warships fronting up to each other. We've already seen it in the South China Sea. We've seen it in the Baltic. Every time a warship does a freedom of navigation exercise, you see it countered by a Chinese or a Russian warship. The most famous one from the UK point of view, of course, was HMS Defender, demonstrating a freedom of navigation within 4 miles of the coast of Crimea. And it was countered immediately by the Russians. And I think that's going to be a feature of the future. The rules-based system coming under challenge all the time by these autocratic Eurasian powers seeking to push naval forces further and further away. And let's be honest, China is claiming territorial seas out to 1,500 miles in the South China Sea. They're supposed to be 12, it's 1,500 miles. And we're going to have to challenge that at every point. If we don't, it'll go by default. One of the things I frequently say in my presentations is, in the UK, if you don't walk a footpath for a year and a day, the landowner has the right to apply to close it down. The same thing applies at sea. If you don't walk those footpaths and make sure that you assert your right to freedom of navigation, the local landowner will shut it down. And that'll become a real feature around Eurasia at the hands of China, Iran, and Russia, particularly in the Baltic and the Black Sea. It's going to be a state of seismic activity, I think, in the border lines between these two blocks, which will mostly be at sea and in the air, I suspect.
Thank you very much, Admiral Parry. The next question is from Professor Brendan Sims, who is the Director of the Center for Geopolitics. So he has 2 questions, and I will start with the first one. Shouldn't the Royal Navy be deployed to the High North or Black Sea against Russia? Isn't that where the main threat now lies? And isn't that what the United States want us to do? Ms. Kearns.
Apology, there were the bells ringing in Parliament, and we have to go and vote. Sorry, could you just also repeat the start of the question again? Apologies.
Of course, of course. So the question is the following one. Shouldn't the Royal Navy be deployed to the High North or Black Sea against Russia? Isn't that where the main threat now lies? And isn't that what the United States want us to do?
I haven't seen any requests from our US allies for us to do that, and I haven't seen any requests actually from our Ukrainian or other allies to do exactly that. So it might well be that is strategically what we should be doing, but I have to say it's not something that when I meet with my counterparts from those countries, they are asking for us to do. Look, the role of our Navy ultimately in Ukraine is limited, and I'm absolutely by no means an expert in naval power, but this is not one where we need to be focused on naval power as yet to fight Ukraine. We need to be focused on providing the support the Ukrainians have. They do not have the ability, I think, to utilize that sort of support. And I'm not convinced that actually it's something that would be helpful at the moment. At the moment, we need to make sure that our Baltic partners have the space to be able to have the conversations they want about what alliances they may or not wish to join and what is right for them. And I think, frankly, if we deploy too much of our Navy, we risk antagonizing conversations and discussions that are taking place, when actually we need to leave the space for those to happen politically within those domestic countries, but also without antagonizing diplomatically. Because if we are to mobilize too greatly, I worry that we risk making it look to Russia, who are looking for any excuse to claim that foreign powers are meddling in the decisions of those countries and states, that we are in some ways trying to force or push that. So I think it's a really difficult one, because no decision is without politics. And ultimately, not acting is a political decision. It is a decision not to act, not to deploy. And I think currently it is absolutely right that I would not be rushing to move our Navy in any way, sense or form to those locations, because I think it sends the wrong message, because I don't think it allows for diplomatic work to happen, and most of all, because I worry it would infect or in some way undermine conversations taking place by our partner allies within their own countries, where they need to have the space to have those without it appearing or being manipulated that we are somehow intervening. So it might be that is a genuine request being received. I haven't heard that as yet coming through when I speak to my counterparts, but that is not what I would be encouraging us to do if I was looking politically at what is right now in order to minimize further escalation of the current crisis.
Thank you, Ms. Kearns. Admiral Parry.
Right, I'm going to say that the key to maritime power is its flexibility. You can send ships on goodwill visits. You can't send attack helicopter squadrons. They don't do goodwill very well. And there's a fundamental difference between maritime forces and any other form of power projection. And they can stay over the horizon. They don't have to be seen. I mean, typical of that right now is, answering your question, Brendan, HMS Albion is leading an amphibious group up in the high north at the moment. There are probably 1 or 2 nuclear submarines giving the Russians a hard time up there at the moment. We can't say. As far as the Black Sea is concerned, we can't actually deploy anything to the Black Sea right now, even if we wanted to, because of the Treaty of Locarno. It says that when there is a war going on inside the Black Sea, then the belligerents have the right to ask the Turks to close the straits, which they have done. So nobody, including the belligerents or ourselves, can actually put naval forces in there. Now, having said that, let's not confuse naval with maritime forces. Maritime forces are those that also provide surveillance, intelligence, and all sorts of other assets. For example, a Poseidon RAF maritime patrol aircraft is a maritime asset, and also is in the Baltic quite frequently. It would be in the Black Sea. If you look at where the Americans are deploying some of their maritime air power at the moment, it's in our NATO allies in the Black Sea. And that sort of intelligence, that sort of reconnaissance is being provided to the Ukrainians right now. There's no question about that. So allies can be supported from distance. They don't have to be supported directly. Maritime forces are infinitely flexible. They can be deployed, they can show interest and intent, but in most cases, opponents don't know what that intent is. That's the beauty of maritime forces. They're at sea. You don't know what they're there for. They could be doing an exercise. And so the utility of them means that you can, veer and haul. It's as simple as that. But the actual exigencies of the High North and the Black Sea are as I described them. One is constrained. The other one, I think we're quite active up there right now.
Thank you, Admiral Parry. Professor Lambert.
Yes, I think that's, I would agree with all of that. It's worth noting, I've referenced the Crimean War before, because I think it is highly relevant. The Crimea is Russia's naval bastion on the Black Sea, but the war is not fought in the Crimea, it's fought in the whole of the Black Sea region, it's fought in right around the Baltic, it's fought in the Northern Ocean, British naval power in the White Sea, and it's fought in the Far East. There's a major British and French naval attack at Petropavlovsk. So using naval power against Russia is not constrained to those 2 theaters. The Arctic is equally important, and the Far East as well. And in all of those regions, Britain is part of alliances and partnerships, and it would be able to reinforce efforts there by its friends and allies, should that be necessary. But the obvious place presently to deploy British naval force in a deterrent capacity is supporting allies in the Baltic because we can enter the Baltic and we can operate in the high Arctic. So at the moment, it looks to me, leaving aside the nuclear submarines, which we can't locate, but we have to surmise that they're well positioned, that the Baltic and the high north is the main focus of British naval effort. And that will be distracting Russian attention from other things and keeping the pressure up on the Russian regime as it faces the prospects of staging another major offensive. So that is the best thing to do. And the Black Sea always has suffered from that limitation since the end of the First World War, that it can be closed. It was always a difficult political question whether going into the Black Sea with the British fleet would not give the Russians an excuse to leave the Black Sea and enter the Mediterranean, which was something the British never really wanted to see. So again, you have to judge what effect you want to achieve. Supporting the embargo, supporting allies, upholding the NATO relationship across this region is critical. And in the current situation, that is entirely possible. I entirely take Chris Parry's point that if it becomes a shooting war, it is not a place for anti-submarine warfare assets to be patrolling.
Just one thing on that, Victoria, we should be aware, I think, there's a very powerful Russian squadron in the Eastern Mediterranean at the moment, operating out of Syria. And it can't actually get into the Black Sea to support the Ukrainian war because the straits are shut. And that includes the two sister ships of the Moskva. So a very powerful squadron that's been locked out. So even the Russians can't get in there. And that's their only warm water port in Sevastopol.
Thank you very much. And the second question was, if the Navy is to go east, isn't backfilling in the Indian Ocean the most sensible task rather than entering dangerous waters in the South China Sea? Admiral Parry.
Well, I don't know what people think we build warships for. They're to go in harm's way. That's entirely what they're for. That's not me saying that, that's Churchill. Now, the fact of life is the Royal Navy will go where the political objectives demand it conducts its role. There's no question about that. And if we have to go into the South China Sea to assert freedom of navigation, if we have to coerce China, if we have to do anything, then we'll operate there as well. Again, I get back to the point, what we need to do in peacetime, tension, and war. Now, there's a discussion about whether we would put our aircraft carriers in harm's way. Well, whenever I have this discussion with people, I always say aircraft carriers aren't supposed to go in harm's way. It's the assets that actually deploy from them that go in harm's way. You never, ever see carriers in sight of each other, or indeed in sight of any sort of other force. So how we fight those carriers is going to be a very interesting exercise in how we conceal, we deceive, and we do all sorts of other things. But if you have ships that aren't losable, frankly, they're not usable. So saying it's better to stay in the Indian Ocean rather than stray into the South China Sea, if the political objectives are there, then we have to fulfill them. If we'd have said in 1982, oh, it's a bit difficult, 8,000 miles away, and we could lose a few ships, then Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have lasted another month, I would suggest. So the political objectives were achieved, the military victory was achieved. We're still living with the good legacy of that today, politically and militarily.
I think there's a very interesting point here, and we see it with the loss of the Moskva. Continental powers, of which Russia is very obviously a significant one, tend to see ships as fixed assets and to retain them for their diplomatic and political value.
That's right.
In the two world wars, the Navy that lost the most ships was the Royal Navy in terms of on the winning side, because the British understood that ships were to be used and they were there to secure strategic effect, to open up communications, to defeat the U-boat threat to Atlantic communications, and ultimately to deliver Allied armies into not just Northwest Europe, but also Southeast Asia. So you build them to use them, and maritime powers understand this. Losing ships is what happens. And putting them in a safe place means they're still around when the war is over, but you've lost the war. If you don't use them in the way they're meant to be used, you risk leaving the war with your fleet intact, having been defeated, That's precisely what happened to Germany in 1919. They had to surrender their fleet. They hadn't lost many ships fighting, but they lost all of it at the end of the war. So, think about what you want your ships to do. Make sure you've got the right ships to carry out the missions that you intend to carry out, and anticipate the threats that you might be facing. Make sure you have the fleet that can do the job, and then you won't have to hide it and pretend it's not there. You can put it where you want it to be. And yes, aircraft carriers project aircraft power. They don't project ship power. They are ships which project over distance. And going forward, it's not just aircraft, it'll be unmanned systems as well. And it's very significant that the Queen Elizabeth transit into the Indian Ocean, into the Pacific, hooks up with the Japanese and an American aircraft carrier. We see cross-deck operations of a sort that took place in the Korean War, when the British and the Americans were operating carriers in the region around the Korean Peninsula. So there's nothing new under the sun. We've been here before. We've been to these places before. We've done interesting things there, and we've worked with allies in these locations. My father was on a British aircraft carrier off Korea in 1951 to 53. They cross-decked with an American ship. They were based in Japan, and they refitted in Sydney. That doesn't sound at all unlikely as a projection for the future.
Thank you very much, Admiral Parry and Professor Lambert. I would just like to update our panelists and also our guests that Alicia Kearns unfortunately had to leave a bit earlier due to a very busy day, as we know, at the Palace of Westminster. But we have more comments and more questions from our audience. And we've received a comment from Geoffrey Mount-Evans, who is a member of the House of Lords and Cambridge Geopolitical Centre Baltic Advisory Board member. So he states the following: Admiral Parry made a very important point. Everything is related to political objectives. The Royal Navy being active, albeit as a smaller player in the Indo-Pacific, is important for the US, whose principal focus of interest is China. Support from and involvement by the UK is very much welcomed. It has a bearing on keeping the United States committed to peace in Europe, a lesser concern for them at present. Admiral Parry, would you like to add anything?
No, I agree with that entirely. And I think the key, though, is that the key thing about maritime power is that it is inherently global. So in tandem with what Geoffrey says, is that global Britain is global maritime Britain. And that has to extend not just across the naval front, but across the whole comprehensive spectrum of all our interest and all our aspects to do with the sea, from shipbuilding through oceanography, through all our green initiatives and things like that. And the one thing the United Kingdom lacks right now is a comprehensive maritime strategy. If it had one, it could confront the likes of China, which has a very good maritime strategy, to the extent that they subsidize their fishermen's fuel, for example, all the way through to oceanographic research supporting their navy. They have a joined up, comprehensive approach and investment in their sea. And guess which nation they copied in doing that? They copied Britain in the 18th century. It's a direct copy of the way we did it. Everything from insurance, through shipbuilding, through planting oaks to make sure we had enough wood for the ships, was part of a comprehensive national strategy. We don't have that today. The United Kingdom needs that if it's going to be global Britain in reality.
Yeah, I think that's a really strong point, and the history is very clear about this. Sometime in the later 19th century, we started to lose contact with the sea. We started to take decisions which were much more domestically focused. And the radicals who thought that cutting taxes was more important than security managed to tilt the balance a little bit too far the other way. So we absolutely need to see our maritime engagement as global, as affecting every part of this country and every part of its relationship with the rest of the world. The people we talk to are maritime connections. They're maritime legacy issues. The United States, after all, was a British colony, or parts of it. The reason they speak English is because they are former British colonial territories on the East Coast. So we have to see the world in a very particular way, because we're never going to stack up against Russia or China as large continental hegemonic powers. We're never going to be self-sufficient in critical supplies, starting with basic things like food and other strategic raw materials. We are going to have to be out there in the world, and the sooner we realize that and make it central to the way we do business, the sooner we'll be in a position to exert the influence we wish to exert. At the moment, there's a degree of talk which we can't absolutely back up. We need to change that. We need to think about how Britain became the center of the global maritime economy in the 18th century, and the benefits that brought to the whole country. Losing that in the period from the end of the Second World War onwards changed the country. And we've made a change again in the 21st century. We're looking at a future as a global player again. And we need to step up and look at how we can make that work more effectively across all disciplines and departments. We need to think globally, and we need to think maritime. And that's way beyond defense. That is, as Admiral Chris says, that is everywhere. And it needs to be joined up. We need somebody who is Secretary of State for the maritime.
Yeah, a Marine Minister, absolutely.
Yes, we absolutely need that. And then we've got a central coordinating point around which all of these things can fit together. We have strategies for less important things. We should have a strategy for this. It is the most important opportunity for Britain going forward.
Thank you. Another question is from Ava McKee. How much does Great Britain spend on maritime, naval, military power as a proportion of GDP now? Admiral Parry.
I haven't a clue. Essentially, that has to be related, as I said earlier, to the political objectives that are required, and an assessment of future context and the appliance of technology and human skills in relation to what can be achieved in relation to those objectives. So sort out the context, sort out how much investment you want to make in the future, and then balance it out according to the effect that you want to achieve. I'll give you an example. Everybody's screaming at the moment for more boots on the ground for the army, but nobody can tell you what those boots on the ground are for. The army doesn't actually have a view on what it should do with more soldiers. Until it does, they shouldn't be given any. Now, as I said, I get back to the point. The proportion of GDP that should be spent on maritime or naval power is related to what you want it to do as a national instrument of power within the context of how you see the present and the emerging future. That's it. During the Cold War, we spent 1.9% of GDP, which is almost what we spend on the whole of defense today, on the Navy. But that was at a time when we spent 5.2% of GDP on our armed forces as a whole. So in summary, sort out the context, sort out whether the maritime, the air, the space, the cyber, or the land is the best instrument to exert leverage in terms of defense and obviously looking after your interests, and that gives you the answer. I can't tell you a round figure. All I would say to you is that actually the integrated review has recognized the primacy of maritime power for Britain heading into the future. We've got 8 classes of submarine and shipbuilding during this decade, and we've got a maritime chief of defense staff. That really tells you the flavor it's going. And I would ask people, you know, in future, we're going to be looking for armed forces that have high impact, low footprint. That's the key issue with the technological challenge that we've got into the future. Static armies are not the thing that we need. We need, as I said, high impact, low footprint. What you're seeing in Ukraine right now is a 20th century war. We need to be geared for the 21st century. Simple as that.
And we need to gear that maritime focus because we don't have the option of building large tank armies. And for the nostalgic old soldiers who want to revive the British Army on the Rhine, it's an awful long way from the Rhine to the Dnieper. You know, check it on the map. if you send British soldiers onto the continent of Europe, it'll take them a very long time to get all the way over there. That is not what is needed. Britain needs to play to its strengths in this crisis, not to reinvent the wheel, which was dismantled 20 odd years ago, of having permanent military commitments in Europe. That isn't.
And Andrew, another thing is you leave the Panzer stuff to those that need it the most and can do it the best.
Absolutely. It is not, you know, you focus on what serves your interest and how you can best achieve effect in the areas you need to be.
That's it.
And do not interfere with regional specialists. You know, people who know the area best should be leading on these things, and it's perfectly possible to support them. And that goes for the Baltic, South China Sea, everywhere.
And just one thing on Europe, if you think about it, one thing the Russians obsess about, it's something that Khrushchev mentioned in a Time magazine article in 1954. He said there are two arms that reach round and strangle Russia. They're the Baltic and then the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And in future, technology is going to allow us to project power onto the continent of Europe. That means we can disrupt, we can produce mass effect against mass activity and mass armies that before has not been possible. And so the whole geometry of conflict in Europe has changed. And as Andrew says, the idea of mass tank armies is a thing of the past. Give you an example, Russia can dominate Western Europe simply through its missile arsenals, both air launched and surface launched. Doesn't have to invade us at all. Look what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. It's pulverizing Ukrainian cities. It can threaten us with that if it wants to. So we've got to be able to counter that in future. We've got to think 21st century, not 20th century. That's the point.
Yep. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Admiral Parry and Professor Lambert, for your insights and for your speeches. And I'm afraid that this is all the time we have for this evening, but we were absolutely delighted to have an opportunity to hear from Professor Andrew Lambert, Admiral Chris Parry, and Alicia Kearns on this very important topic. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do follow the Center for Geopolitics on social media and check back their website to stay updated with their work. The video recording for this event will be uploaded in a few days' time, and links to the website and YouTube channel are available in the chat. Thank you very much for joining us once again, and we are very much looking forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you very much.